All right, hello and welcome to this late afternoon session on the CRA. So the CRA has landed, now what? My name is Tobie Langel. I run a small consultancy called UnlockOpen, and as part of the work that I do, I'm currently helping the Eclipse Foundation with the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, ORC Working Group, where we focus currently very much on the CRA. So today we're going to talk about those three things. First of all, CRA fundamentals, going back to basics, just explaining what it is, who it impacts, etc. Secondly, we're going to look at the major difference that the CRA brings to the table compared to every other compliance effort before then, which is that it focuses on the full software supply chain. And then lastly, we're going to look at how the ORC working group steps in and how it helps. So let's get started with the why of the CRA. And I'm going to essentially just use the European Commission's own words for a start, because I think it's spelled out quite clearly why they're doing this and what the intent behind the CRA is, and why this matters. I think that understanding the intentions behind the legislation really helps in addressing it correctly and figuring out how to comply to it in a way that's reasonable and that makes sense and that's effective, and it actually solves the kind of problems that the European Commission wants to address with this legislation. And so, the first point, sort of like what creates the reason for this whole effort, it's essentially all of the cyber attacks that we've seen increasingly in the last decade, and that have impacts not only on economics, right? There's a number here that's pretty large, but also, and this is something that the European Union cares a lot about, on civilians, impact to privacy, impact to security, etc. And I think this is a really key point, right? The sentence that's on the website of the Commission and part of their strategy says, from baby monitors to smartwatches, products and software that contain a digital component are omnipresent in our daily lives. Less apparent to many users is the security risk such products and software may present. Right? So this is really about acknowledging that software is everywhere, that it has security risks sort of like as part of what software is, and that this impacts people, and that people are not necessarily aware of the risk of the software that they're using, and a lot of the software and the products with software in it aren't very secure. And so essentially what the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA, wants to do is to safeguard consumers and businesses who are buying and using products that are placed on the European market. And the goal is really to make inadequate security features become a thing of the past. Right? It's to solve the problem of software security in every kind of product that is placed on the European market. And what's really interesting is, in that same sentence, it says who actually has to do this, right? It's manufacturers and retailers. So the onus is on people who are, in organizations who are selling software or physical products with software components to make sure that those software is secure, right? And the other aspect, which is really interesting here, is how are they trying to solve this, which is really the what, right? And this is through mandatory cybersecurity requirements. And what's really interesting is it's throughout the whole product lifecycle, right? So it's not just when you place something on the market, but it's also to make sure that after a certain number of years, and there are specific requirements depending on what kind of products, et cetera, that the product continues to be safe. So, the IoT cheap camera that you get, and that's probably unsafe the day where you put it, gets worse after 3 or 4 months, et cetera. This is the intention is for this to be a thing of the past. So, looking at the who, right? There are multiple actors mentioned in the CRA, but the key ones that are our focus here really are manufacturers, which is essentially a software vendor or a vendor of a physical product with software components. And it's essentially anyone who's placing a product on the market, on the European market, right? And this is, regardless of whether you're a European company or not, it's the fact that that you want to sell in the EU turns you into a manufacturer. The second interesting category is a new category that was added somewhere in the middle of the whole CRA effort, is open source stewards, right? Open source stewards are essentially code hosting foundations, but they can also be for-profit organizations as long as they're not monetizing that particular piece of software that they're a steward to. And then another key component, obviously, is open source maintainers. The CRA essentially says that if you're not making money off of software, of open source software, and there's no intention for you of that software to be used in products, you're out of scope. So that's good. However, if a lot of people rely on your software, there's going to be a lot of pressure and a lot of need from the manufacturers implementing that piece of open source to help them comply to the requirements that are imposed upon them, right? And so it becomes like this very classic shift left kind of problem where it makes more sense if the security and the cybersecurity requirements are shifted upstream, really. But then who's going to pay for this? Who's going to do that work, right? And that's like one of the tension that we will need to solve in the upcoming years, the years leading to the implementation of the CRA. Now, the what. So what exactly is required? What exactly does the CRA require? Well, a number of things of manufacturers. First of all, it requires to do cybersecurity risk assessment of essentially the whole life cycle of the product, right? So that you can do secure by design development. And then you have cybersecurity requirements that govern all of the different phases of software. So from planning, designing, development, and maintenance, right? And it's true not only for the software that you built, but across the whole supply chain, right? And we'll get back to this because this is really something that's entirely new. And as I mentioned before, it's throughout the whole product lifecycle. And then the third big one is vulnerability management, reporting, and upstreaming of fixes. There are obligations around all of these, right? Which is really, really interesting. Essentially, as a manufacturer, if you find and fix a bug in a piece of software that you use, regardless of whether that piece of software is open source or not, you have to upstream that fix in a machine-readable format, right? i.e. a pull request, right? Doesn't have to be a pull request, but that's the intent, right? And so it's kind of a GPL for security vulnerability, if you will pass the term, right? Yeah, and so, the fact that manufacturers have to manage maintenance across the whole supply chain, this requires them to perform due diligence of all of their open source dependencies. So essentially, they have to be able to demonstrate that the open source that they pull in their project meets the requirements of the CRA. So for open source stewards, on the other hand, it's a light touch regime, right? And essentially what they have to have in place at the minimum is a cybersecurity policy and a way to manage vulnerabilities that are reported to them. And then both have additional requirements. There are additional requirements for products that are important and critical. So those are products that are either security related. For example, like a password manager will be security related and it's going to be an important product as a result. Or that impact the, either like a lot of, that can have like a lot of impact to other physical or software goods. So for example, an operating system, or that contain, or that can contain data or information that touches upon privacy of people, or could impact their health or their well-being. And then they all have to cooperate with market surveillance authorities. Okay, so that's kind of like the high level of the CRA. Now, how exactly is it going to be implemented? Because if you look at the CRA, you see the actual definition of what the manufacturers need to do. It's kind of like a one-liner in an annex, for example, right? And so how that's going to actually work out, where the requirements going to be defined, well, there's kind of like two solutions, right? One is you build your own solution, and then you have to demonstrate that this solution complies with the text of the law, right? Or you can implement the harmonized standards, which are going to be developed over the course of the next 2.5 years by the European Standard Organization, so that's ETSI and Sensenelec. And implementing those will provide a presumption of conformity. So the burden of proof that you're compliant is no longer on you. It's assumed by default that that's the case. I'm going to slightly pause here. All right. Then there are how long is this going to be, do you think? Should I just speak over it? Does it look like they're into it, or? All right, so there's construction work going on. I'm going to give this like another 30 seconds because it's going to be really distracting if like there's construction work in the background. And if that doesn't work, I'll just continue. So the question in the room is, how many holes are they drilling right now? And we don't know. It's a wild guess. All right, so I'm just going to speak over the drilling because if not, we're never going to get done. So essentially, in the harmonized standards, as I was just mentioning, there's going to be additional implementing acts that the European Commission is empowered to build. And for example, an attestation program that will help with the manufacturer's due diligence requirements. And also best practices that get formalized into specifications can help with due diligence, right? So essentially you will see more legislation, formal standards, and essentially a set of specifications and also tooling. The when. So the CRA entered into force on November 11th, so literally 2 weeks ago. And so that started the clock ticking, right? Now it's an official EU legislation. And in 3 years from now, all obligations will need to be fulfilled. So that's by December 11th, 2027. But the vulnerability reporting bit is earlier. It's on September 11th, 2026. Right. And the harmonized standards are also, they also have their own timeline. Can you actually pay attention like this? Is this like, is the noise entirely distracting to you, or you okay? It's okay for you? Okay, cool, good. It's super distracting for me, so I was just wondering if it was also distracting to you. And then you have the harmonized standards, and those are also have like their own agenda when they're going to be finished. They've just started them, right? And you will notice that the horizontal type A standard is due to be finished on August 30th, 2026. And that's the set of standards where the vulnerability reporting is going to be standardized that will need to be implemented on September 11th. So you literally have 11 days to figure out what's in the standard and do the work. And so that's not going to work, right? Like, it's super important that you start paying attention now, because if you wait for the standards to be there to start figuring things out, you're going to have a really hard awakening. And the CRA's fines for non-compliance and impact, you literally will have to remove products from the European market if they don't comply. And the fines are very, very large, right? So it's not something that you can just like wait and see. It's something that you have to start paying attention now. All right. And so I hear a lot of you, there's sort of like two kinds of answers to this, right? One is we're in SME compliance, like, oh my God, like no idea how to get started, like this is horrible and very scary. I hear you, right? Like, yes. The other kind of answer that we get is, well, you know, compliance, like we're a large company, we already do this, right? And they're like, how is this any different? And that is where the CRA's, that's where the key CRA innovation is. It's that it's requiring full supply chain compliance, right? And so if you look at this graphic on the left, you have this sort of like standard software stack. And the data, and this is data from the open source security reports from Synopsys, used to be Black Duck. And essentially what those reports tell us is that in any kind of software application, right, about a quarter of it is proprietary software, and the rest is open source dependencies, right? And so compliance so far essentially only looked at like, what is it that you've built internally, right? And what is it that you've purchased from someone else? The CRA kind of like entirely flips this and says, you're now responsible for your whole supply chain, and that includes this whole 75% of open source. That's roughly in everyone's application, that now as a manufacturer, you're responsible for when you ship it in your own products. And that really changes everything, right? And you know, the way that supply chain compliance was handled before is you look at authored and procured code, and essentially compliance is internal policies, right? And agreements, legal agreements with vendors. Like, you know, you're just buying off someone who's also complying to the same compliance requirements that you have and you're done, right? And like, this is the real big change. The whole open source supply chain, like that compliance has to be brokered with the open source community, the maintainers of projects, the open source stewards, etc., right? But the compliance requirements, the ones getting fined if like that's not managed properly, are the manufacturers, which, I mean, you know, makes sense. Like, they're the ones making money off of open source software. It makes sense that like they're the ones to be responsible for like using it securely. But they cannot do this alone, right? There has to be some form of collective work to figure out how to do this. And this is where the ORC working group steps in, right? And so the idea behind the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group is to be this neutral forum where community and industry can work out the whole supply chain compliance together, right? And if you look at the mission of the working group, it's a bit of a wall of text, but I'll get into the specifics, right? But really the idea at the top is the mission of the ORC working group is to serve as a neutral forum for the open source community, maintainers, industry, small and medium enterprise, research, open source foundations, and related nonprofits to come together, right? And then it's to understand and develop a point of view in emerging regulation, et cetera, because the ORC actually does not only CRA, but all of the other stuff that's coming up, like the Open Source AI Act. But really, this is what it's about. It's like this neutral forum where industry and community can come together and figure out like how to manage compliance requirements. And so the focus is essentially of the working group is on these four things. The first one is close the knowledge gap. What we've noticed from the get-go is like no one knows what the CRA is about, right? It's scary, like the community is not used to it, the industry is not used to managing open source that way. So there's a lot of education work that's going on, and this talk is an example of this. So that's like a primary focus. The second focus is technical development, which is actually building specifications to formalize best practices, right? And also to provide input to the standard organizations like Sensenelec and NETSI. The Eclipse now has a liaison with the relevant working groups working on those standards, and essentially to bring the voice of the open source ecosystem there. The third focus is institutional engagement. So again, with standards bodies, but also with the European Commissions and other institutions to essentially coordinate what the community and industry, how the industry and the community want to manage the compliance aspects, and collaborate with the institutions to make sure that what they end up with actually works with how the open source supply chain works. And then lastly, the last focus is representation, because if it's like 3 organizations talking, it has a lot less impact than if it's 100 or 200, right? And so we already have a number of members across the industry from both actual industry players like Nokia or Bosch, for example, tool companies like Scanos, and then a lot of foundations like the Apache Foundation, the Rust Foundation, et cetera, right? And so that's really how we're trying to address and help the community and the industry come together to help address this challenge. And of course, you can come and join us. Membership is free for nonprofits, foundations, et cetera. There's a reasonable fee for SMEs. And then, of course, bigger players support us more. And we not only need your help as a voice, but we also very much need financial support to run this effort, because it is a costly endeavor. And so, yes, please come and join us. Thank you very much. I have negative 4 minutes to take questions. But I will still nonetheless take questions if there are any. Thank you. No questions? Wonderful. Thank you so much.